Hello everybody and welcome back to the Folklore Tree. In this week's video we're going to continue our discussion on folktales by talking about three of the most influential theorists in folktale research. Vladimir Propp, Bengt Holbek, and Axel Olrik. They also happen to have three of the best names in existence, after Benedict Cumberbatch of course. Now, Olrik, Holbek, and Propp each describe the specific patterns that people use to create and perform folktales, and also how we can use those patterns to analyze the way folktales reflect our everyday lives and values. Now, Olrik describes a series of epic laws that the plots of most folktales tend to follow. Propp describes the Dramatis persona, or the different character profiles that are most often found in folktales. And finally, Holbek describes the patterns that people use in the telling of their folktales. So let's start with Ulrik's Epic Laws of Folk Narrative, which is, I'm sure, a title that many folklorists would love to use for their books. Now, these laws tend to apply slightly more accurately to epic poetry. That is to say, long-form verse narratives like Beowulf and the Odyssey that tend to sit somewhere on the spectrum between legend and myth, which we talked about in Genres video if you remember correctly. But even when applied to generic folktales, they still work very well. As Olrik writes, anyone who is familiar with folk narrative has observed when he reads the folklore of faraway people that he feels a sense of recognition even if this folk and its world of traditional narrative were hitherto completely unknown to him. Olrik attributes this sense of recognition to two main factors: the common intellectual character of primitive man, and the primitive mythology and concept of nature which corresponds to this character. I'm not even gonna get into how problematic these statements can get, and if you've watched my videos on the history and development of folkloric studies, you should know how bad that sounds. Questionable statements aside, Ulrik's epic laws are basically meant to help us determine whether a story comes from a written or an oral tradition. Let's go through some of them rapid fire. The law of opening and/or closing, a formulaic phrase that indicates whether a participant is entering the world of the story or leaving it. For example, once upon a time and they all lived happily ever after. Law of repetition, parts of the story are repeated more or less verbatim. This helps add emphasis and dramatic tension to the story, like in Little Red Riding Hood. All the better to see, hear, smell, eat you with, my dear. The law of three, things tend to happen in threes in folktales. This is also called tripartite repetition. Things like the three bears, the three brothers, the three billy goats gruff, 3 trials, 3 days or nights, and so on. This law can also be altered to other significant numbers based on the religious, cultural, or aesthetic preferences of the teller or audience. 4, 7, 12, and 13 are also commonly used numbers. The law of 2 to a scene. Only 2 characters can interact at a time. This helps the teller keep track of their characters and prevent them from getting things mixed up. Other characters can hang around, but only in the background. The law of contrast. Character qualities are emphasized by juxtaposing them with their direct opposites. For every beautiful, poor, or cunning character, there must also be an ugly, wealthy, or foolish character. The law of twins. More or less indistinguishable characters tend to serve the same function. The 2 ugly stepsisters, the 7 dwarves, the first 2 little pigs, and so on. This ties in pretty closely to the law of repetition. The law of first and final position. Emphasis is placed on the first or last objects in a given story. For example, the first brother always fails where the final one succeeds, and Cinderella always loses her slipper on the last night of the ball. The law of attributes being expressed through action. A character isn't just described as being sad, clever, strong, etc. They have to actually be shown doing things like weeping, outwitting others, or performing feats of strength. Actions speak louder than words. The law of logic. The universe within the tale must be consistent in how it operates. No changing the rules and no ignoring pre-established factors, or you'll end up with more holes in the plot than Swiss cheese. The law of unity of plot. The story has to continually move towards its natural conclusion. No adding superfluous elements and no ignoring important ones. For example, a magical tool must always be used. And finally, the law of concentration on a leading character. The protagonist is the primary agent of the story and so must appear most often. Other characters only exist in relation to the protagonist. Ugh. That was fun. That's enough of Olrik for now, though, so let's move on to Vladimir Propp and his concept of the Dramatis persona. Propp's profiles for the Dramatis personae describe a variety of character archetypes that help drive the plot and structure of the story. Basically, the Dramatis personae drives character motivation and interaction and shapes how the entire plot of the story works out. For now, though, let's just focus on the different character profiles as described by Propp. Rapid fire mode, engage! The hero carries out the quest and gets the reward. Marriage to the princess, increase in wealth and status, and so on. The villain does bad stuff and fights against the hero. The donor provides the hero with a magical tool to help them succeed in their quest. The helper, the sidekick, helps the hero in any number of ways, often overlaps with the donor. The princess, and/or her father, the love interest and/or the reward, or rewarder, assigns tasks, marks the hero as worthy, exposes the false hero, etc. The dispatcher, the one who sends the hero on their quest. And finally, the false hero, a lying liar who lies. They want to usurp the hero and claim their reward in their place. Now, folktales don't have to have just one of each kind of character. One character can serve multiple functions, or one one function can be served by multiple characters. Some might not even show up at all. Though characters are not usually limited by the roles they play, how they get introduced usually is. For example, donors are almost always happened upon by chance. Helpers can be given to the hero by a donor, but they are just as likely to be rescued or helped by the hero in some way, and so want to repay their debt by helping the hero on their quest. Overall, though, Propp tends to focus the most on how folktales work. He operates on the assumption that by understanding how folktales are put together, we can better understand how they work and why they are the way they are. And the roles that characters play in a story are a major part of this. Moving on one more time to Holbek. Holbek defines folktales as a category of tale in which a hero or heroine is subjected to a series of trials and tribulations characterized by the occurrence of marvelous beings, phenomena, and events, finally to marry the princess or prince in splendor and glory. Kind of old news for us since we started looking at folktales in detail in this series, but it's also important to remember that there are exceptions to every rule. The tales most of us are familiar with do indeed involve magical tools, people, or events, but many of them don't. Ultimately, though, Holbek wants to formulate a method of interpreting the so-called marvelous aspects of folktales as expressions of the thoughts, feelings, and norms of the people who participate in their telling. This tends to become most obvious when you consider, you guessed it, context. For example, I've already mentioned a couple of times how folktales were originally told by and for adults, the focus on children being more recent, but who tells a story can massively affect the contents of that story and how it gets told. For example, Holbek observed that men and women would actually have very different tale-telling repertoires. This is largely because they tended to tell stories in different contexts. Traditionally, men used to tell most of their stories at work to other men, while women usually told their stories at home to an audience of mixed genders. As a result, men's tales tend to feature mostly male protagonists, while women's tales tend to feature a mix of both male or female protagonists. Remember from the last video that folktale protagonists have to be designed in such a way that their audience can personally identify with them. Now let's go to the board for this next segment. Holbek also suggests that because of the patterns folktales tend to follow, we can infer that most of the tales we're familiar with were traditionally told by working class people, and that certain elements of those tales reflect the kinds of problems those people face in everyday life. For example, Hansel and Gretel's parents dumped them in the woods because there wasn't enough food to go around. We can tell this because of the values that folktales tend to promote and the crises that characters might face. Wrongs get righted, the poor and powerless are recognized for their true worth, the protagonist is rewarded for their good qualities of fame, fortune, and a general step upwards in social class, the fashionable cat gets a fancy pair of new boots, you get the idea. Holbek also outlines something we already talked about in the previous video, that folktales reflect the typical life journey of the average human. Kids leave home, grow up, get hitched, and settle down to raise a family of their own. These can be major challenges and sources of anxiety, and not just for the people of the past who we traditionally associate with folktales, but for people right now too. Now, traditionally speaking, young men couldn't start courting until they were well on their way towards gaining their own independence. They have to find a compatible partner, get her parents' consent, and procure a kingdom of his own. That is to say, he's got to get some hecka fine real estate. And these were the days before the internet came along and made everything much more convenient and yet infinitely more complicated. Now, what Holbek argues is that the marvelous aspect of folktales actually represent real people. For example, fighting and conquering a dragon is supposed to represent resolving a conflict with a potential partner's parents. Now, Olrik, Holbek, and Propp's theories get infinitely more complicated than I can possibly describe in one video. So this is all we've got time for today. If you want to learn more about their theories, I provided links to their books in the description. Or you could potentially take some folklore classes if they're available at a school near you. So this has been an episode of the Folklore Tree. Thank you all so very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.